I was elbow-deep in a transmission casing when the woman in the white linen dress walked into my shop. Not the office. The shop, past the sign that says, employees. Only, past the hydraulic lift, with a Ford F-250, sitting 3 feet in the air, straight through the smell of gear oil, and brake dust like she had decided those things were other people's problems. My guy Tommy looked up from the workbench, and I saw him open his mouth to say something. She raised one finger without looking at him. He closed his mouth. "You, Sawyer Boone?" she called across the bay. I set down the ratchet. "Depends on who's asking." Margaret Ellison Crane. I knew that name. Most people in Knoxville knew it. The Ellison Crane family had been in Tennessee whiskey for 4 generations. Barrel aging, single malt, heritage label. The kind of bottle that sat in the back of restaurants behind glass. Their main distillery out on Route 11 was one of those places tourists photographed from the road, without ever getting close enough to smell the oak. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and came out from behind the truck. She was standing in the middle of my floor, like she owned it. Late 30s maybe. Dark hair, composed face. The kind of tired that hides well behind good posture. She had a leather document case under one arm and one hand gripped around the strap, like it was keeping her upright. "What can I do for Ellison Crane?" I said. She looked at me for a second. "I need a husband by Monday." Tommy dropped his wrench. It hit the concrete floor and nobody moved. "Lady," I said, "I rebuild engines. I don't do whatever that is." "I know what you do." She opened the case and pulled out a single sheet. Not enough to read, just enough to show she had done her homework. 6 months ago, my brother Elliot tried to purchase this property through a holding company called Ridgeline Acquisitions. "You turned them down." I stared at her. That was him. Yes. He offered 30% above market. I know what he offered. "And you still said no." "My grandfather built this shop in 1971. The floor's still the original concrete." She looked down at the floor, then back at me. "I know. That's why I'm here." I crossed my arms. "Why me specifically?" Margot's jaw moved once before she answered. "My grandfather died 8 weeks ago. He left the distillery to me and Elliot jointly, with a control clause in the trust. If I'm not legally married before Monday's partnership review, Elliot gains temporary sole operational authority. He already has a buyer. A national spirits conglomerate out of Louisville. They'll strip the heritage label, consolidate the recipes, and shut down the cooperative within 18 months. I looked at her. "And your lawyers can't stop it." My lawyers wrote me a very detailed explanation of why they can't stop it. "So marry one of them." "All 3 are married, 2 are Elliot's former college roommates, and the 3rd is afraid of him." She looked toward the parking lot, then back at me. Her voice stayed even, but the hand on the document case did not. "I need someone Elliot can't leverage. Someone without debt he can call in, without ambitions he can redirect, without history he can twist." "And I'm what? Easy to overlook?" "No," she said. "Hard to move." That got my attention. Elliot has spent 6 months trying to acquire or outmaneuver every asset connected to that distillery. Yours is the one property on the South Access Road he couldn't touch. You didn't need the money. You didn't want the exposure. You didn't take his calls. She paused. A man who can't be bought is hard to find on short notice. I looked at her for a long moment. Tommy had gone very still on the other side of the shop, pretending to sort bolts. "What do I get?" I asked. "Compensation. Legal protection. A clean dissolution agreement drafted before we sign anything. Your shop stays yours. Your property stays yours. I have no claim on your business, your assets, or your time beyond what we agree to in writing." I didn't ask about money. Margot looked at me for the first time since she walked in. Something behind her eyes shifted. "What did you ask about?" "The truth," I said. "All of it. Not the version you practiced in the car on the way over. The version with the parts you left out because you thought they'd make me say no." She looked toward the hydraulic lift. The F-250 sat there, heavy and patient. Old machines had a way of making people honest. When she spoke again, her voice dropped a register. My grandfather built the cooperative by hand. He and 2 cousins, in 1958, with white oak they sourced from a mill in Sevier County. He was not a good man in most ways that matter. He was hard on my grandmother, harder on my father, and he ran his family like a business ledger where the debts only ran one direction. She stopped, cleared her throat. But those barrels are still aging. And the whiskey they hold is still the recipe. He and my father worked out the summer before my father died. Elliot doesn't see that. Elliot sees a licensing deal and a buyout figure. He will sell everything that can't be moved in a spreadsheet column. The shop settled around us. Old metal and oil, and the faint sound of Route 11 traffic outside. You'd be dragging my name into your family's mess, I said. Yes, my shop, my guys, yes. If this goes sideways, people won't say you found a man with integrity. They'll say you paid one. Her chin lifted. I know that. I looked at her for another second. All right, I said. She blinked. Just once. I'll hear the rest. And if I say yes, one condition. Name it. You see what you're asking me to risk before we go anywhere near a courthouse. You come here. You meet the people this touches. You stand on this floor and look at what I'd be putting in the middle of your family war. Margot looked down at her linen dress, then at the oil stain 3 feet to her left. All right. Not all right like you're being polite, I said. All right like you mean it. She met my eyes. I mean it. Behind me, Tommy exhaled so hard it was almost a word. She came back the next morning at 7:30. White sneakers instead of heels. Hair pulled back. She brought coffee from the gas station on the corner because she had driven past it and thought it seemed right, which told me she had been thinking about the visit the night before. My shop foreman, a man named Dwight, who had worked for my grandfather and then for my father and now for me, came out of the back office and looked at her, the way he looked at every stranger. Like he was deciding whether they were worth his time. You the one who wants to marry Sawyer? He said. Margot did not flinch. Yes. You in trouble? She looked at him. Yes. Dwight nodded once, slow, then he'll help. He went back into the office. I watched Margot watch him go. She stood there a moment, holding her coffee, and I could see her take that in. No title, no document, no negotiation. Just a yes, because the question had been answered plainly. I walked her through the shop, the alignment rack, the brake lathe, the engine hoist my father had bought, used in 1994, and that I had rebuilt twice since. 3 guys were already working. I pointed to each one in turn. Eddie has 2 kids under 5, and a mortgage on a house in Fountain City. Pete is putting his daughter through nursing school in Nashville. Tommy over there just bought his first truck, a '98 Silverado he's fixing on his lunch breaks. You come after me, you make their lives harder too. Not hypothetically, actually. Margot looked at each of them. I understand, you're starting to, I said. At 10 o'clock, I was across a desk from an attorney named Miss Kaufman, who had an office above a dry cleaner on Gay Street, and who spoke the way people do when they have no patience for wasted time. She walked me through every page. The compensation terms, the property protections, the confidentiality clause, the dissolution pathway. You understand this arrangement is unusual, she said. I got that impression. Yeah. You also understand it is entirely legal if both parties are entering voluntarily and with full knowledge. I looked at my hands. Grease still under 2 fingernails no matter how hard I scrubbed. I understand. Margot waited in the hall the entire hour and did not knock once. By noon we were at the Knox County Courthouse. No music, no flowers, just Miss Kaufman, Margot's attorney Gordon, a tall man who looked like he wanted to be somewhere more predictable, a magistrate with reading glasses on a chain, and me in the cleanest shirt I owned, which was a dark blue flannel I had ironed that morning badly. The magistrate looked over the paperwork. You both understand the legal nature of this union? Yes, Margot said. More or less, I said. The magistrate looked at me over his glasses. I cleared my throat. Yes, sir. Margot's mouth moved, not quite a smile but close. Then came the rings. Gordon whispered something to Margot, and she went still. In that particular way people go still when they've forgotten something they should have remembered. I didn't have time, she said quietly, and her voice was the first unguarded thing I'd heard from her. I reached into my shirt pocket. My father's, I said. It was a plain gold band, wider than what most people wore now, slightly scratched on one side, from decades in a machine shop. I had kept it in my truck's center console since he passed, just in the particular way you keep things you can't explain. I'd grabbed it that morning without fully deciding to. Margot looked at it like it had weight beyond what was in my palm. We can use it, I said. You can give it back after. She nodded. But when she took it from my hand, her fingers weren't steady, and when she slid it onto my finger, I felt the tremor in her hand. Small. Just enough to be real. I looked at her, and for a second, the magistrate and the attorneys, and the fluorescent courthouse lights, all fell back, and it was just the two of us, and a ring that had belonged to a man who built things that lasted. Sitting on my hand in a building, neither of us had planned to be in that morning. Then the magistrate said we were married, and the world came back. The partnership review was at 3. The conference room at Ellison Crane's downtown attorney's office smelled like leather chairs, old coffee, and the particular kind of tension that builds when money is about to move. Elliot was already at the table. He was younger than I expected. Mid-30s, tan, a suit that fit too well. He had the smile of someone who had never lost a negotiation and had decided that said something about his character. His eyes moved over me the way you price out a vehicle you're about to lowball. Margot, he said, this is creative even for you. She placed the marriage license on the table. The clause is satisfied. Elliot's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. You married a mechanic this morning? Restoration mechanic and shop owner, I said. If you're going to summarize my resume, use the full version. The room went quiet. One of the older attorneys at the table lowered his eyes fast. Elliot looked at me for the first time like I had actually spoken. I'm sorry? I restore classic vehicles. American muscle, mostly. Work that takes time and doesn't cut corners. I leaned back in my chair. You probably know something about cutting corners. Margot touched my arm under the table. I read that clearly enough. Elliot's smile thinned. And what exactly did she offer you, Mr. Boone? Nothing that would interest you. Everything interests me. That's probably your problem. One of the Ellison Crane board attorneys, a woman named Patricia, who I later learned had been with the family for 20 years, put down her pen and pressed her lips together in a way that looked a lot like suppressed agreement. Elliot turned back to Margot. You think a license from this morning satisfies the spirit of what grandfather intended? I think it satisfies the language, Gordon said, stepping forward, which is what the trust specifies. He laid out the documentation, page by page, clean and thorough. Patricia read everything twice. Elliot watched Margot the whole time. You've made yourself look desperate, he said. Margot's voice didn't move. I've made sure you can't sell the cooperage by Friday. That landed. Patricia set down the last page. The condition has been met. Operational authority remains with Margot Ellison Crane, jointly administered per the original trust structure. Elliot stood, buttoned his jacket, looked at me with that easy smile that didn't reach his eyes anymore. Enjoy the honeymoon. Enjoy second place, I said. Margot's hand closed around my forearm under the table, firmly, before I could say anything else. Elliot left. For about 4 minutes, I thought we were done. Then Margot's phone lit up. Then Gordon's. Then Patricia's assistant opened the conference room door with the expression of someone who had just been handed bad news in an envelope. Margot read the screen and went still. She turned the phone toward me. A local news site. The headline had my name spelled correctly, which somehow made it worse. Ellison Crane Heiress courthouse marriage. Slammed as trust fraud by family source. Elliot, she said. Outside the conference room windows, a camera crew was setting up on the sidewalk below. Margot's driver called to say there were people outside her building. She stood very still, and I could see her running calculations. Margot Ellison Crane was the kind of woman who was always running calculations. I picked up the document case and held it out to her. You needed a husband by Monday, I said. She looked at me. You've still got one. Pack what you need for a few days. She showed up at my house at 8 that night with a rolling suitcase, a garment bag, a leather tote, and the expression of a woman who had been composed for so many hours that the effort was starting to show at the edges. My house sat behind the shop, 40 feet from the back bay, close enough that I could hear the shop door in a heavy wind. Small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a back porch that looked out over a stand of old tulip poplars, and a living room my mother had described as honest, which I had taken as a compliment at the time. Margot stepped inside and looked around. It's small, she said. I set her suitcase by the wall. Off to a great start. She caught herself. I didn't mean it as a criticism, you did. But I'll allow it. She exhaled. Something small and tired and almost human. Guest rooms on the right. Closet rail sticks on the left side. The bathroom faucet runs cold before it runs warm, so don't give up on it. Coffee maker's temperamental but functional. Window in the guest room doesn't lock, but this is a quiet street and I'm 40 feet away. She looked at me for a long moment. You really know how to welcome a wife. First time. Working on it. That first week was not a marriage. It was a siege conducted indoors. Margot had attorneys calling before 7 in the morning, board members calling through lunch, and Elliot's name appearing in her messages with the frequency of bad weather. Someone had photographed her leaving the courthouse. Someone else had surfaced my business license and a photo of the shop from Google Maps. Tommy started answering the shop line by saying, Boone Automotive, no comment, regardless of who was calling. At night, Margot sat at my kitchen table with her documents in neat, precise columns, while I ate reheated food out of the containers it came in. She slept in the guest room. I slept badly in mine. Nothing happened the way anyone on the internet would have written it. But things shifted. Small things. The kind you don't notice in the moment, and only later understand were the actual story. She learned the coffee maker needed to be started twice, once to prime it, once to actually brew, or you got lukewarm water and resentment. I learned she took her coffee black until 9 o'clock, and with too much sugar after that. And she acted like this was a consistent system rather than what it was. She started leaving her shoes at the back door aligned side by side, like they were standing at attention. I stopped leaving my boots in the middle of the kitchen floor. Not because she said anything, but because I noticed them differently once someone else lived here. One evening I came in late from a site visit and found her standing on a chair in the guest room, fighting the window. What are you doing? The window doesn't open. You're lifting it wrong. You have to angle it toward you first. That's not how windows work. It is how this window works. I reached past her and showed her. The window gave and rose about 5 inches. Margot looked at the gap like it had personally offended her. I'll fix it properly this weekend, I said. You said that 4 days ago. I've been busy being publicly married. She looked over her shoulder at me, and for the first time she laughed. Not a polished laugh. A real one, surprised out of her, like she had forgotten for a moment what week it was. The next morning she came into the shop at 8, with coffee for everyone. She had stopped at the place on the corner. Not a coffee chain, just the old diner, and she had asked Dwight the day before what everyone took, because she had been paying attention. Tommy looked at his cup. Saw his name written on the side in her handwriting. He looked at me. She knows my name. She has functioning eyes, I said. Dwight watched her talking to Eddie near the alignment rack about a brake line routing question she'd read about in a restoration forum. Just because she'd been curious. He came to stand beside me. She's not what I figured, he said. What you figure? Rich trouble. She is rich trouble. Yeah, he said slowly. But she pays attention. That's different. A few days after that, I took her to the distillery. Not the main building, the cooperage. It sat a quarter-mile back from the road, a low stone building with a cedar shake roof that had been replaced twice but kept the same pitch. Inside, it smelled like wood and slow time. The barrels were stacked on their sides, in long rows. 63 gallons each, white oak charred on the inside. The newest ones were 8 months in. The oldest were 22 years. Margot walked in and went quiet. I walked her through what I saw. Not the business of it, the work of it. This stave here is checking, I said, running my hand along the seam of one barrel. You leave it, you risk losing the seal. You address it now, it holds another decade. I moved further in. That corner has humidity damage in the stone. Cosmetic right now. Structural if you ignore it through another winter. I put my hand on one of the oldest barrels. Anybody who tells you these should be moved to a climate-controlled facility is either cutting costs or doesn't understand what the variation does to the spirit. Margot stood in the center of the room and said nothing for a long time. What? I said. My father used to come here every Saturday morning, she said. He'd walk the rows and knock on the barrels. I don't know what he was listening for. I never asked. She paused. I've owned this building for 8 weeks, and you're the first person who's talked about it, like it matters beyond the balance sheet. After that, she was different with me. Or I was different with her. Hard to say which direction it moved from. She started reading the repair estimates I sent to clients before I sent them. You sound impatient here, she'd say, leaning over my shoulder at the kitchen table. I am impatient. The guy's been stalling for 6 weeks. He's still paying you. She'd retype the last paragraph and it would come out professional and clear, and I would read it, and not quite say thank you, but I'd send her version. I fixed the guest room window the Saturday after I said I would. She stood next to me and handed me screws with more confidence than accuracy. That night she opened and closed the window 4 times, just because it worked now. My father's ring stayed on my finger. I told myself it was for appearances. There were cameras occasionally. Board members passed by the shop sometimes. Elliot's attorneys were watching. But there were plenty of nights with no one around, nights where the shop was locked, and the street was quiet and Margot was reading at my kitchen table in socks and one of her work sweaters. And I could have taken the ring off, and I did not. 6 weeks in, Elliot called an emergency review. The claim was straightforward. The marriage was a transaction. I was a prop in work boots. Margot had manipulated her grandfather's trust language, and the arrangement should be voided. Margot came with Gordon and a binder. I came from a brake job. Clean shirt, my father's ring catching the light from the conference room windows. Elliot clocked it immediately. I saw his eyes drop to my hand and stay there for a half-second. The questions started careful. Where did we live? How were household expenses divided? What were our intentions beyond the trust requirement? Before Margot could answer, the last one, I leaned forward. Depends on whether she stops piling legal briefs on my half of the kitchen table. I said, I had a system before she moved in. Coffee on the left, keys on the right, mail in the middle. Now I find motion filings every time I sit down to eat. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Patricia lowered her eyes to her notepad, but not fast enough. Margot looked at the table, but I could see the corner of her mouth. It landed the way it did because it was true. Not true like a story we'd rehearsed. True like her mug next to mine in the sink every morning. True like knowing she turned the porch light on when I was working late without either of us ever mentioning it. True, like the way I'd learned to listen for her car, pulling into the drive, and didn't feel settled until I heard it. The board declined to give Elliot what he wanted. Again. Afterward, Margot and I ended up in the hallway outside the conference room. Gordon had gone ahead. Elliot's team was gone. No one was watching. She stood beside me with her arms folded, looking at the floor, the way she did when she was processing something she hadn't finished yet. "You didn't have to make that sound real," she said. I looked at her. "I didn't make it sound like anything." She turned. The space between us was smaller than it had been 6 weeks ago, and we had both been pretending not to notice that. "Sawyer," she said. She said my name like she meant it. Not like a closing argument. Not like a document heading. Like she was talking to me specifically, which sounds like a small thing. Unless you've spent 6 weeks watching someone, be careful with everyone around them. I didn't get to answer. She stepped closer, put one hand flat against my chest, and kissed me. It wasn't for the board. It wasn't for Elliot. It wasn't for the trust clause or the cameras or the license dated 8 weeks ago. It was just us. In a hallway that didn't belong to either of our families, with no one watching and nothing to prove. When she pulled back, she looked at me like she had surprised herself. "We should leave before someone charges us for the corridor," I said. She laughed, and her hands stayed on my shirt for one more second. On the drive back, she rode in my truck instead of the town car. The windows were down because it was a good evening for that. At every red light on Broadway, I could feel her looking at me in the way people look when they're deciding something they've already decided. When we got back to the house, she set her bag on the kitchen chair and stood there. I took off my jacket and hung it on the back of the door. "We should not treat this as something that already happened," I said. "We should let it be something we actually choose." The tension in her shoulders released. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Don't look too relieved." "I'm not relieved," she said. "I'm just tired of having things happen to me instead of choosing them. So we did it the way that made sense to us. Slowly." She still slept in the guest room for a while. I still made bad coffee. She still edited my client emails and insisted she was only improving clarity. But when she passed behind my chair at the kitchen table, her hand rested on my shoulder. When I came in late from the shop, she looked up from whatever she was reading with the expression of someone who had been listening for the door, but wasn't going to mention it. Some nights we sat on the back porch after dinner, listening to the tulip poplars move in the dark, talking about nothing that Elliot could subpoena or attorneys could file. The agreement stopped feeling like a contract. It became a habit, then a choice, then something I stopped imagining taking off. Elliot kept moving for a few more weeks. His plays got smaller each time. The board had seen enough. The trust review closed in Margot's favor. The cooperage stayed off the sale list. The heritage label stayed intact. The barrels kept aging. One evening in late October, I came home from checking a suspension job in Maryville and found Margot at the kitchen table. No laptop, no phone, no briefs in columns. Just one folder. She had changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a gray crewneck sweatshirt. One of mine, the one with Boone Automotive in cracked lettering across the chest. Her hair was down. Her face was steady in the particular way it got when she had already been through something hard and had decided not to go through it again in front of me. "What's that?" I asked. She pushed the folder across the table toward the empty chair. "Annulment paperwork." The kitchen went quiet except for the ceiling fan. I didn't sit. Margot folded her hands. "The terms are clean. Gordon reviewed everything, and so did an outside attorney. Your shop, your property, your equipment. Nothing is touched. No penalty, no required statement, no timeline pressure. You walk away exactly as you came in, legally and financially." I looked at her. "You practiced that?" "Yes. How many times?" "More than I'd like to say." I pulled out the chair and sat across from her. She kept going before I could speak. "The clause has expired. The board is stable. Elliot has lost every challenge he had. You held up your side of something I had no right to ask of you, and you did it better than I had any reason to expect. She took a breath. I don't want you staying because this started as an obligation, and you're too decent to leave before it feels finished. I watched her hold herself together. That was Margot. She always handed you the clean version first, the one she'd drafted the night before, so her hands wouldn't shake while she said it. You think that's what this is? I said. Me finishing an obligation? I think you are loyal, she said. And loyal people sometimes mistake staying for choosing. That hit in a place I hadn't expected it to. I opened the folder, read the first page, names, dates, legal language precise enough that I could tell 2 attorneys had touched it. A clean exit from something that had stopped being a tisset a long time ago. My father's ring caught the light as I turned the page. Margot noticed. I saw her notice. You can keep it, she said quickly. The ring, if you want. Or not. That's entirely. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. No. She went very still. No, I said again. You walked into my shop and asked me for the truth before I said yes to anything. I asked you for the same thing on day 1. So here's mine. She didn't move. I don't want the table back, I said. I don't want the guest room empty. I don't want to drink coffee in the morning without your mug on the counter. I don't want to hear about those barrels from anyone else. I don't want to drive past the distillery and not feel like it's partly mine to look after. I pushed the folder further away. I don't want to take this ring off and call it a tool we used. Her eyes went bright. I was trying to give you a way out, she said. Her voice was quieter than usual. I know. That's the most Margot thing you've ever done. She looked at the folder. Then at me. I don't want out either, she said. Write in the comments. Was Margot right to give me the exit? Or should she have trusted that I was already home? That was the moment the arrangement ended. Not in a courthouse, not in a conference room, not when a magistrate signed a document. It ended at a kitchen table covered in old scratches, with rain starting outside, and my father's ring on my hand, and Margot in my crewneck sweatshirt, pushing a folder neither of us wanted back toward the middle of the table. After that, life didn't get simpler. It got ours. The cooperage restoration moved forward. My shop took on 3 new classic builds, and Dwight finally hired the apprentice he'd been putting off for 2 years. Elliot filed 1 more motion in January, was denied, and went quiet. The Heritage label ran its best sales year on record. The 22-year barrels were tapped in the spring, and Margot let me be there for the first pour, standing in that low stone building that smelled like wood and slow time. And I understood then why her father had come every Saturday. A year later, we had a real wedding. Not downtown, not catered, not photographed for a magazine. We did it at the distillery on an October evening, when the leaves on the ridge were going orange, and the air smelled like cool air and oak. Dwight stood up front. Tommy wore a tie he had argued with all morning and lost. Eddie brought his kids, who spent the reception chasing each other between the barrel racks, and nobody minded. Margot came through the cooperage doors, without the composed face, without the leather document case, without any of the armor she had walked into my shop wearing 11 months before. She looked like herself, which was the best thing I had ever seen. I used my father's ring again. This time no one said we could take it off later. Afterward, we stood near the oldest row of barrels, while the evening light came through the high windows and fell across the floor. Margot leaned into my side, like she had decided that was where she was supposed to be. Years from now, when people ask how we met, she'll smile before she says anything. I needed a husband by Monday, she'll tell them. And I'll tell them the rest.